Welcome back to movementprofessional.com. So today I want to do a video in response to a question I had from a friend of mine, or a second mother to me, Mrs. Noreen Gregory. She asked me, I did a video about band work a little while back, and said, is it appropriate for people that are over the age of 50? I think so. I think one of the ways we have to break this down, though, is looking at what are we trying to do when we're doing the band work. So the last video I did was just a squat prep, so I was going to do a back squat. So the work I was doing was very specific to the back squat. Now, if you're not going to be doing those type of movements, you got to ask yourself first, like, what position do I want to work on enhancing? So if it's just kind of general function, we can look at the shoulder, we can look at the hips, we can look at the ankles. We can just ask ourselves, like, what positions do we really need to do throughout the course of the day? So that's step one before we decide to use any bands. We just want to know, like, what are we trying to enhance? So if we look at the shoulder, well, we can talk about that first. I think without looking at any specific weight training movement, we can just think of a hand behind head position. Kind of takes into account a lot of shoulder motion for overhead. So we have flexion, we have abduction, and external rotation. So if we just kind of touch the opposite shoulder blade, we can assess overhand function. So we want to know what position we're trying to enhance, and then we also want to use the movement to see what our baseline is. So real quick, hand behind head would be just if I touch my shoulder blade, one side versus the other, I want to see if one side feels tighter. I want to see if I can reach the top of my shoulder blade. So a good goal would be to actually touch the bony part of your shoulder blade, which would be the spine of the scapula, and just notice if there's a difference there so we can retest that later, because any band work that we do, we want to make sure that we're assessing something that was a baseline just to see if we're actually making some change. All right, so we want to know if, what are we trying to enhance? So shoulder would be hand behind head, and then also hand behind back is the kind of counter or the other motions of the shoulder that are not tested with going hand behind head. So that's going to be internal rotation, extension, and adduction. So we're going to look at all of those, and if we're going to assess the range of motion there, we want to see if we can touch the bottom of the shoulder blade. So you can see my right side is quite a bit different than my left. So that's going to be something I want to test and I want to work on, but I have that information now. So when I go into any modality that I'm trying to use to enhance this range of motion, I know what I'm starting with. All right, so once we understand what position we're trying to enhance, and then we understand what our baselines are, then we're going to look at, if we're going to use bands, like what resistance makes sense. So if you're feeling that it's new to you, you want to use a lighter resistance. Okay, so we have like skinny, we have medium, and we got real thick. All right, and then the other thing to think of is if I'm going to do my shoulder, do I want to double the loop or do I want to keep it single? So if you're new to it, and that's what we're talking about here, we just start with a thin band, and we're going to start with just a single loop, which means I'm just going to walk forward so it catches the shoulder. A double loop would be I wrap it twice, and that gives me more of a 360-degree support in the shoulder. All right, so the whole idea of the band here is to give feedback and resistance to keep the shoulder in a position that is more optimal. So most people with the shoulder are going to have problems with it being too far forward. So if you have a range of motion issue or a mobility issue, we want to actually use the band to help mobilize the joint capsule and keep the shoulder in place while we sort of stretch around it. If you have a stability issue, which would be you have too much mobility, so if you're testing these hand behind head, hand behind back, and you're feeling like you have more than enough range of motion, you could still use this exercise, but your focus is going to be much different. Instead of trying to get more range of motion, you just want to hold your shoulder in place and then do some resistance exercise or some muscle contractions around the area to help stabilize the shoulder into a more optimal position. So you use the same type of movement or the same type of holding position for the band on the shoulder, but your focus might be completely different. So for me, I'm going to definitely have an issue with overhead on my left side, and then on the right, it's going to be hand behind back. So I know that, so I'm going to focus more on improving my mobility. But if you have plenty of range of motion, then you can just hold your shoulder in place and then just go through the motion, but don't fight for range. Just me actively moving the arm is now working the muscles I need to stabilize this position without the head of the humerus coming forward. All right, so if I'm going overhead, it would be the same thing. I want to make sure that I could reach overhead without the head of the humerus coming forward. So the band just gives me a little extra feedback and just holds a better position. All right, so you can go back and forth through there. All right, and then you're gonna just, if it's new to you, you start with maybe 5 to 10 reps. If you've been doing this for a while, I like to set a timer and do about 2 minutes. All right, so with the shoulder, we would look at hand behind head position, hand behind back position. All right, we're gonna pick, if you're new to it, you're just gonna start standing. You're not gonna get into any deep positions that you're not comfortable with, and you're just gonna have the light banded resistance pull your shoulder back and go through the range of motion to what you feel comfortable with. So it's absolutely appropriate for anybody as long as you're able to kind of gauge what you feel comfortable with, and then over time you can go a little farther and get into different positions that might be a little bit more challenging. So if we look at the hips, other positions that we can look at is one, just standing. So again, we would try to pick what band is most appropriate. So for a bigger joint, maybe we want to pick a bigger band, but it's really, again, up to what you feel comfortable with. So I'll use green in this case, which is kind of a medium-sized band. I'll get into the band, and then with standing, I want to enhance, I want to be able to get my hip to fully extend. So let me take myself out of the band real quick. If I show that from the side, fully extended would be, this is me extending my back, this is me extending my hip, where the hip crease comes all the way forward. So I'm going to just use the band to enhance that hip crease coming forward and not have my back arch, which would keep a little bit of an angle at the hip here. So that's all I'm doing. I just got to make sure I'm safe getting into the band. And then all I want to do is kind of bend a little bit and try to straighten and push that hip crease into the band, squeeze my buttocks on the other end, and it just enhances this standing position. All right, so that when I'm in a standing position, that I know I'm able to actually fully extend the hip. All right, so the band gives me a little extra feedback that I wouldn't get without it, so it's direct resistance to the front of the hip joint. All right, so I would do that to enhance standing. I can also look at, if I wanted to get into, and if I had the ability to get into a hands and knees position, or a quadruped, and I can enhance hip flexion, hip extension from there. So I'm gonna get the band on my hip, I'm gonna go into hands and knees, and then I would drop back and do sort of a child's pose position and then come forward. So what this allows for is me to improve hip flexion going back, and then I can work against the resistance coming forward. So I'm enhancing my range of motion into hip flexion in a semi-weight bearing position. All right, so if you can do this movement without the band and go back and forth and there's no pain with that and you feel comfortable with it, there's no reason you can't add the band and enhance the position and bias one side over the other. All right, and then the last position I would look at is half kneeling. So if I'm in just a single kneel position, I can bend forward, and in this case I'm flexing my hip, and then I can also work on hip extension here, which is a split position. It's not dissimilar to if I was standing on one leg, this side would be extended, this side would be flexed. So when I'm in a half kneeling position, can I get into this position first? How does it feel one side versus the other side? All right, so I get a baseline, and then I would just use the band to enhance the position. So my left hip felt a little bit more restricted when it was down. So I'm going to come here, which is flex, and now I'm going to feel the band pulling me back into flexion, and then when I come up, I get resistance into extension, so it helps me activate my glute, but it also just helps me enhance this position. So I can do this 10 to 20 reps, or I can do it for a timer for about 2 minutes until I feel like I've really loosened this up. And then once I get out of the position, I would just want to reassess and just see if it feels a little bit freer. All right, so I hope that answered the question that you can really, anybody can do these positions. You just got to make sure that you can first get into the position without the band, know what you're trying to work on, have a baseline, and then just add a little bit of resistance, and it should help enhance the position. If you have any questions, you can go to movementprofessional.com. I'll see you next time.